Hi everybody, Johnny here. Let's go over CalTPA Cycle 2, Rubric 2.7. This sits under Step 2, Teach and Assess. So let's start by reading the essential question. How does the candidate use results of informal assessments, including student self-assessment, to provide feedback to students about how to improve or revise their work to continue progress toward and or beyond the learning goals? So what matters here? Feedback. And you want to be using both the informal assessment and self-assessment that you've given your students to give students the feedback. So it's the results from those things. What matters a lot in this particular rubric is how you use your own rubrics for informal and self-assessment to build the feedback. All right? And the whole point is to give students feedback so you're moving them towards the learning goals that you've set out. Let's continue to level 3, the base level. It's a level you should start from. And a reminder, you must meet all level 3 requirements. Missing any one moves you to a level 2 score probably. And in this particular block, this level 3 for this rubric, is just one block here. And let's look at it together. Candidate uses informal assessment results, including student self-assessment results, to provide feedback to students, and here's the key part, based on rubric criteria that clarifies, and we want to make sure the next ones are understood well, what was done well, where there were errors, and what students need to do next. So there's 3 things here. Hold on to those importantly. To improvise, revise, or advance learning to continue progress toward meeting the learning goals. All right? We always care about those learning goals, always moving towards those. So the musts. You must work from informal assessment results, and remember each one of your forms of assessment has a rubric to use at least once. So your formative or formal assessment needs to have a rubric, your informal assessment needs to have a rubric, and your self-assessment needs to have a rubric that you use at least once in some way to capture student learning. You want to be working from student self-assessment results, again, from the rubric. And then you want to provide feedback. Now this feedback could be written or oral, and always based on the rubric criteria. If you're working with younger children, it might be that you do more oral feedback. You're talking to them in discussion, they're working together in pairs, and you're talking with them, giving feedback appropriate to what they're doing. Whatever you do, you want to make sure you capture evidence of your feedback. If you're doing written feedback, that's plain. You can have written samples or copies of students' work. If you're talking to students and giving them feedback, then you need to capture that in your video. You need to give feedback on what was done well. This is one of the 3 things. You need to give feedback on what was mistaken, all right, or misunderstood. And you need to give feedback on what needs to be done next. All right, so let's make sure that these 3 are caught, are very well represented in your work. So remember, feedback has to give examples of, or have students think about what was done well. The feedback has to give kids directions on what was mistaken. And your feedback needs to give direction to students so they know what to do next. All right, so those 3 things are very important. Now remember, so level 3 on this particular rubric, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things you want to do. Try to get all of them done so that you can get at least a level 3 score. Let's look at a level 4. Now, as we've said before, often a level 4 score is just a bit of a step up, not a giant leap. You saw how many requirements there were for level 3. Let's look at level 4, and you might see that maybe just a bit more work, a little bit more work will take you from a level 3 to a level 4. So level 4 says all of level 3 plus, candidate connects assessment feedback to students' prior learning to draw students' attention to broader understandings of knowledge, skills, and abilities related to the learning goal. So the most essential thing in the musts on this one are clearly students' prior learning. All right? So connect feedback to students' prior learning, what came before the assessment, focus on learning as a progression, getting better over time, not just the result on one assessment. So you can imagine your feedback might talk about what's happening in the moment for a student, but also talks about where they were prior to that moment, how they've been progressing over time, so that you're connecting to their prior learning. It's not just one moment of feedback for one particular activity and how they did on that one instance of learning. Thinking about the student as having learned things over time and giving feedback in that way to show that you understand their progression over time is a good way to go. So that's level 4, and you can see level 4 essentially has one thing to do: focus on prior learning. And so the move from level 3 to level 4 is not huge here. Let's go to level 5. On level 5, we can see that there are 2 blocks here, so let's look at each of them. In the first block, all of level 3 and 4 plus candidate differentiates how they provide assessment feedback to students based on individual learning needs. All right, so in terms of a must, what you're doing is you're giving different feedback for different students based on their own progress and their own direction in their learning. All right, so you're not giving generic feedback, the same feedback to everybody. You have good knowledge about where any particular student is in their work and what kinds of needs they have, what kinds of direction they need to move in, and your feedback is tailored to individual learning needs. Let's take a look at the second block. Informal assessment feedback informs continual improvement for the whole class and individuals and leads the candidate to make purposeful decisions about next steps for student learning. There's an "and" in here, and whenever there's an "and," that means there's 2 things going on here. So we want to make sure that we get both of them. So in your work, the must is you need to reflect on the feedback cycle. Okay? How is this feedback that you're giving to students part of your overall assessment plan that helps you to improve your teaching and their learning? So if we think about the feedback cycle as assess and then analyze results and reflect on them for yourself, using what you've learned about the assessment and the results, giving feedback to students, and then after having given feedback to students, you support them to use that feedback well, and you continue instruction, and then after continuing instruction, you assess again, starting the cycle again. You think about how that particular cycle improves your teaching over the course of the event, and also how it improves students' learning over the course of your teaching event. All right? The next one that has to happen is you need to talk about how the work that you've done through this kind of assessment, using feedback and informative assessment, is helping you think about what needs to happen next for your students. All right? So what are the next steps for learning based on your work in assessment in this way? All right? So again, there's an "and" statement, so you want to try to get both of them. So for this particular rubric, the sources of evidence, you have the 4 annotated video clips. And remember, in this particular one, it's a bit of a challenge. You want to have, if you can, have physical copies of things that you've written good feedback on. That's good. Otherwise, you want to have really good instances of where students are interacting with you and you're giving very particular feedback. The kind of feedback you want to give needs to be focused on the learning goals based on your rubric results. So you need to be talking about because of the results on the self-assessment, I decided that these 3 students needed a little support going this way, so my feedback to them was. So you're connecting your learning goals, you're connecting your assessment results on the rubrics to your feedback. So make sure all of those are tight, all right? And you want to have different instances, try to have different instances of feedback, showing that you're tailoring your feedback to individuals and not just giving generic feedback. And then you will have to write all this out in your written narrative too. Okay, so what did the informal or formative assessments do for your teaching and for your students, as well as what do the student self-assessments tell you about them and help you give the right kinds of feedback. All right? I hope this was helpful. And I'm sorry, just remember one thing. To get a level 5, you must do all 3 of these things. Okay? Just make yourself a little check sheet, and that will help you along the way. Hope this was helpful.